It's great that we finally have a version of Baby Godzilla that actually looks decent. No more of that Minya-style attempt at looking cute but failing really hard at it. I wonder what they'll end up doing with the character for this film. Oh. Hello people of the internet, this is Kaiju Noir with another installment in my retrospective on the Heisei era of Toho's special effects heavy films. For this review we return to the Godzilla series with the 1994 film Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla. Yep, for whatever reason they made 2 Godzilla doppelgangers 2 years in a row, with 3 total if you count Biollante. Now if you're familiar at all with the franchise, you'd know that this film has a rather infamous reputation as being one of the lower points of the franchise, with some claiming that it's one of the worst films in the series. Yet despite that, there has actually been a growing amount of support for this film in recent years, thanks to the advent of the internet and social media. With this in mind, I decided to go into this film with an open mind and try to find whatever it is that people truly enjoy about this film. Now, after giving Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla another chance, did I end up discovering a newfound appreciation for this film? No. Once again, we begin our story roughly a year after the events of the previous film, where the UNGCC has finished constructing another giant robot, the Mobile Operation Godzilla Universal Expert Robot Aerotype, aka Moguera. This time around, their mech, built from the remains of Mechagodzilla, is more tank-like in nature and has the ability to split into 2 smaller vehicles, Land Moguera and the Star Falcon. Meanwhile, a subdivision of G-Force creates a secondary plan to stop Godzilla called Project T, which involves the use of Miki Saegusa's telepathy to control Godzilla's actions. In order to prepare for Project T, G-Force sends 2 of their soldiers, Koji Shinjo and Kiyoshi Sato, to Birth Island to meet up with Yuki, another G-Force soldier who's been tracking down Godzilla's activities to that location. After a bunch of meaningless shenanigans that don't go anywhere take place, Miki and the 2 headrunners of the project arrive, those 2 being Dr. Susumu Okubo and Dr. Chinatsu Gondo, the sister of Lieutenant Goro Gondo, who died during the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante. Eventually, Project T fails. At the same time, a new monster called SpaceGodzilla arrives on Earth after previously defeating Moguera. This creature resulted from Godzilla cells that were exposed to the vacuum of space, where it assimilated crystallized organisms and absorbed massive amounts of energy. It knocks out Godzilla and traps little Godzilla before heading off to Japan to build his new fortress and destroy all life on the planet. Now both man and beast must do what they can to prevent the world they share from falling into the wrong hands. Unless, however, the plot gets distracted by more pointless shenanigans that don't go anywhere. Oh boy. To say this film is an absolute mess is an understatement, which is baffling considering how simple the premise really is. What we have here is a plot similar to the mid-Showa era films where Godzilla is more of an anti-hero who protects his planet from otherworldly forces that the humans themselves could not overcome. In fact, this setup was also used in the 2014 film. Yet the writers attempted to flesh out this simple plot by cramming in numerous half-baked and poorly written subplots. The idea behind Project T is brilliant, as it is a less violent means of resolving the Godzilla conflict. Executing this plan here and now actually works, since this is the point in the series where Godzilla and mankind have kind of formed a temporary truce of sorts. So it makes sense for G-Force to start working out different strategies now that Godzilla is no longer attacking Japan sporadically. Finally, Project T gives Miki Saegusa the chance to star as the lead character now that she has the chance to interact directly with Godzilla once again. What bothers me about the execution of this subplot is how Miki isn't on board with Project T initially, and only joins when she's forced into it, as she didn't want G-Force to use one of her less experienced proteges. I always figured that Project T would be the perfect plan for Miki to develop herself, especially after the ending of the last film, where she declared that she would find a more peaceful means of dealing with Godzilla without resorting to killing him. So why object to Project T? Sure, the implications of controlling a sentient being against his will is certainly present, but what other option would there be for Miki besides continuing to act as a Godzilla detector? However, as promising as this subplot is, it ultimately amounts to nothing as Project T is quickly abandoned once it fails after just one attempt. Instead, it's overtaken by a mafia subplot that comes out of nowhere and only serves as one of several distractions before the climax takes place. It's eventually revealed that Dr. Okubo was working for the Japanese mafia and quickly kidnaps Miki in order to control Godzilla so that he can obtain quote-unquote power. It's never discussed what kind of power he's implying, nor what exactly he wants to do with said power. They just want it. And apparently that's enough of a motivation to justify this subplot's existence. Now that I think about it, was Okubo in the Mafia before or after he joined the UNGCC? Why would he think Project T would work again with the exact same equipment, when it didn't even work the first time? Did he think that a couple armed men could protect him against soldiers specifically trained to kill Godzilla himself? While he was attempting to use Miki for his nefarious deeds, was he even aware that a freaking alien was on his way towards his location? Despite the Mafia subplot being extremely lackluster, it kinda had potential for world building. Not since King Ghidorah have we seen the worldwide consequences for Godzilla's existence, and seeing how he would have affected organized crime would have been fascinating as its own story. In fact, both Project T and the Japanese Mafia are ideas that have been implemented in other Godzilla narratives, specifically Godzilla Gangsters and Goliaths and Godzilla Cataclysm. Say what you will about the quality of those comics, but at least they fleshed out those concepts far better than this film did. Oh, by the way, you know how this stupid subplot ends? With telekinesis! That's right. In order to help Koji and company, Miki tries out telekinesis for the very first time in order to aid them in her rescue. This would have been a cool reveal had she explained that this was an extra power she's been working on this whole time, but instead it's just a deus ex machina that the writers pull out of their asses. I mean, seriously! Telekinesis? What's next? Is she gonna unleash the Phoenix Force in the next film? Another subplot involves Yuki's vendetta against Godzilla, which is another aspect that had much potential, but sadly is just as underwhelming as Project T, since it's constantly fighting the audience's attention with the other storyline. This eventually leads me to question exactly why a person like Yuki would be assigned to track down Godzilla for Project T if his goal was to kill him in the first place. Would G-Force risk sabotaging Project T by giving Yuki of all people this position? And how was he able to obtain so many bombs and missiles when this was just a simple reconnaissance mission? Also, if Yuki had a blood coagulant that could theoretically kill Godzilla, why would he keep it to himself? Wouldn't it be beneficial for everyone on the planet if he had shared this development with G-Force? This way they could mass produce it and apply it to Moguera. Also, exactly how long has he had it? Could he have applied it to Mechagodzilla when it was on the verge of killing Godzilla in the last film? And when he misses his opportunity to use the blood coagulant, why is it never brought up again for the rest of the film? Much like the other two subplots, this one features plot elements that were successfully utilized in yet another piece of Godzilla media, Godzilla the Half-Century War. This movie's plot just keeps racking my brain as I'm trying to make sense out of it all, and that's essentially what this story is. A mess of incoherent subplots that take up the majority of the film while constantly crashing into each other like a car pileup at the end of a Blues Brothers chase scene. And I haven't even touched upon the Mothra Miki Saegusa subplot, which I will delve into when I analyze Miki's character development. In terms of the human characters, we have ourselves the most worthless, most idiotic wastes of human existence in the entire Heisei series, as I'm constantly questioning every single decision they make. I suppose I should start out with the most tolerant, and work our way down. As I've said before, the story behind Yuki is a brilliant one, as the overarching continuity between films allows the audience to see the impact that Godzilla leaves behind on both the world and the people that inhabit it. Yuki himself seems to have been very close to Lieutenant Gondo, and was most likely right there in the heat of the battle when the military attempted to use the anti-nuclear energy bacteria against Godzilla. This could mean that Yuki's blood coagulant was a remnant of the ANEB project, but hey, that's just fan speculation. Now exactly how Biollante still exists in this continuity after the time travel shenanigans of King Ghidorah is something I'll delve into later. As for Yuki, we see a man who's lost the motivation to live a normal life, and has allowed his hatred for Godzilla to consume him. As this is happening, he's been noticing how the world is changing around him, thanks to the advances in technology and the arrival of younger soldiers that could make a person like him obsolete. This of course makes him more determined than ever to kill Godzilla before his time is up. Meanwhile, Gondo's sister Chinatsu seems to be his only link to reality and shares a very strong and mutual bond with him, possibly even romantic if not platonic. Perhaps my favorite scene in the film involves a touching moment between Yuki and Chinatsu, where he gives her his cigarette lighter and asks her to refill it by the time the battle is over, thus assuring her that he'll come back alive. Once he begins piloting Moguera, he quickly throws all of his intelligence out the window when he forces the mech to fly towards Godzilla rather than SpaceGodzilla. Why would he go after Godzilla when he's already going to meet him at SpaceGodzilla's location? This brief rebellious stint goes nowhere since he never gets to have his one-on-one fight with Godzilla. Even on a spectacle level, his encounter between Godzilla and Moguera turns out to be a big letdown for fans interested in finding out whether or not this robot could succeed where Mechagodzilla had failed. Thankfully, he does retain some badass points as he attempts to sacrifice Moguera to severely weaken SpaceGodzilla, thus giving up his grudge against Godzilla while finding a new lease on life. As for Koji and Kiyoshi, there really isn't a whole lot to say about them, considering how the movie fails to give me anything to work with here. In terms of backstories, all we really know about them is that they're a couple of goofballs who work for G-Force. I'm guessing they're also trained to be Moguera's backup pilots? I only assume this as they, along with Yuki, were immediately assigned to be pilots once they came back to headquarters. If that was the case, then why would G-Force send two of their most valuable personnel to Godzilla's location at the beginning of the film? Well, anyways, all these guys really do is complain about the numerous tasks Yuki assigns them for the first half of the film, leading me to ask just what the hell were they expecting to do when they got to Birth Island? After Project T fails, they just bicker with Miki as they try to take on Godzilla themselves with nothing but their guns. So this film is telling me that these idiots think they can actually succeed where Biollante, King Ghidorah, Mothra, Batra, and Mechagodzilla had failed? After this debacle, these two are mainly here to move the plot forward by rescuing Miki, piloting Moguera, and putting a stop to Yuki's idiotic mutiny. The only signs of character development that occur with these two is that Koji somehow starts a romantic relationship with Miki even after she has berated him for wanting to kill Godzilla, which is completely justified in this context, throughout the entire film. Meanwhile, Kiyoshi somehow inherits Yuki's obsession with Godzilla and seems to have taken his place as Yuki steps down for good. But considering how Kiyoshi has always been willing to fight Godzilla, this means that the writers have done absolutely nothing to progress or flesh out this character whatsoever. And now we come to the star herself, Miki Saegusa. Oh dear lord, what have they done to you? Well, for starters, she is still acting as a human radar to predict oncoming threats, despite claiming that she was going to do more with her life after the climax to Mechagodzilla 2. Though now, she has built herself a reputation of being a Godzilla sympathizer. This is one thing I actually like about Miki's portrayal in this film, and it makes sense seeing as how she witnessed the more gentle side of Godzilla at the end of the last film. Considering how Godzilla has been less destructive in the last year, this would have given her the opportunity to rally support for her cause, to protect Godzilla's well-being. All of this could have had the potential to make Miki act as a bridge between Godzilla and mankind, and make the two sides come to an understanding that they should both live in peace as long as they continue to share the planet. Instead, she's written as someone who acts like a complete bitch towards anyone who disagrees with her. Like I said before, the reason why people still want to kill Godzilla is completely justified. Let's not forget all of the destruction that Godzilla has caused throughout his entire existence, along with the millions of lives he has ended or permanently scarred, which occurs in this film, I must add. Yet she wants to ride on her high horse, believing that she's right and everyone else is wrong? No questions asked? Jesus Christ, it's like she's become an extreme activist you'd find on Tumblr. This incredibly closed-minded attitude makes no sense for her character. Common sense would dictate that she would be able to understand why people like Yuki and Koji would feel resentment towards Godzilla, considering that she had the exact same mentality up until 1 year prior. At one point, she even makes the claim that the reason why Koji would want to fight Godzilla in the first place is because he's a man, and all men think about is violence. Dear God, she is a Tumblr activist! I'm sorry, Miki, but I'm pretty sure women have been involved in the fight against Godzilla and have been just as willing to put their lives on the line for the fate of humanity. In fact, didn't you yourself work with a female pilot aboard Mechagodzilla? One subplot I wanted to address here is Miki's association with Mothra in the cosmos. At the beginning of the film, we see Mothra still flying off into space in order to destroy a comet that was predicted to destroy the Earth in 1999. Somehow, in the 2 years since the events of Godzilla and Mothra, the battle for Earth, Miki had managed to psychically connect with Mothra. In the film, she communicates with the cosmos through a miniature entity called Fairy Mothra. This creature, from what I could tell, is one of many pieces of Mothra's psyche that she spawned for some unexplained reason. This one in particular is used to relay messages between the Cosmos and Miki. I'm explaining all of this because the Cosmos are the ones who warned Miki about SpaceGodzilla's arrival, and that she specifically was the only one who could save the planet. Now, when I first saw this scene, and given Miki's pacifistic nature, I assumed that Miki would help bring together a meeting of the minds, so as to help humanity team up with Godzilla so that they can work together in order to defeat a common foe. Well, do you know what she ends up doing to help Godzilla and humanity save the day?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Wow, was this plot point a letdown. What makes matters even worse is that once SpaceGodzilla is defeated, you know what the Cosmos do? They congratulate Miki for saving the world. As I watched this scene take place, all I could say to myself was, No! No, you did not! You contributed absolutely nothing! All you did was put on a suit and watched a fight.
Well, I don't know, maybe you could have bitched at him. How about that? That's all you appear to be good for these days. Huh? Used your bitch foo on him? Seriously, 5 ancient sages of bitchdom all gathered together one day on the peaks of Mount Bitch to proclaim your birth. And 100 years later, when all the bitch stars had aligned, you were born and made everybody's life around you a living hell because you are such a bitch!
Thank you, Krillin! And you want to know what the most baffling thing is when it comes to Miki's actions? She spends all this time pissing and moaning at soldiers for wanting to kill Godzilla because he quote-unquote has feelings. Then she explains that SpaceGodzilla, a monster she had no sympathy for, also had the same feelings as Godzilla. What? Is she seriously using the same logic she used for not killing Godzilla in order to justify killing SpaceGodzilla? What purpose does that serve other than to contradict everything she previously stood for?
Stupid! You're so stupid!
Finally, I never thought I was going to get past that story. Well, when it comes to the special effects for this film, there really is nothing new to showcase here. However, the yearly release schedule of these films looks like it's finally taken a toll on Kawakida's team. The Godzilla suit appears to be the same one used in the previous film. I figured this was the case when I saw how ragged the end of his tail looked. In fact, in certain shots where Godzilla is swimming, you can briefly see the tip of the tail hanging on by just a thread. Also, many straight shots of Godzilla and his opponents are used, especially for the majority of the time when Project T is put to use. This uninspired cinematography doesn't do the Godzilla suit any favors, and makes his scenes look much duller in comparison to his previous cinematic appearances. Character-wise, he provides the bare minimum of what you'd expect out of an anti-hero Godzilla. A monster shows up, starts making a mess in his neighborhood, and Godzilla goes out of his way to set things right. Nothing is really done with Godzilla character-wise beyond this setup, and the only thing he has going for him to make the kaiju story interesting is his relationship with his son. However, the screen time they share is so little that you could have retconned little Godzilla's entire existence and the film would have been pretty much the same. Oh yeah, I gotta talk about this abomination. In my review for Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, I went into detail about how glad I was that Baby Godzilla's design moved away from that terrifying live-action cartoony aesthetic that plagued his previous incarnation, Minya. That aesthetic has returned in full force with the son of Godzilla, now dubbed Little Godzilla. Personally, I find him the most disturbing of all of Kawakida's creations, especially with those black, soulless, unblinking eyes. I've said it before and I'll say it again, what may work on paper or in animation may not work so well in live action, especially in the case of Little Godzilla. Narrative-wise, Little Godzilla does nothing aside from acting cute and clumsy, in an attempt to distract the viewer from the film's poorly written story. Once he's trapped and written out of said story, he does act as a motivation for Godzilla to defeat SpaceGodzilla. But I have a feeling that Godzilla was going to go after SpaceGodzilla either way for starting the fight with him. After all, this is Heisei Godzilla. Keeping grudges and finishing the fight has kind of been his thing throughout this series. Now we move on to G-Force's newest mech, Moguera, based on the giant robots from the 1957 alien invasion film, The Mysterians. This guy left quite a negative impression on me upon my first viewing of the film all those years back. His design seemed way too reminiscent of Mechagodzilla, his arms and legs were stiff and useless in combat, his lasers and missiles were not as flashy nor as impressive as Mechagodzilla's weaponry, and overall didn't look like it could have come close to being as efficient as Mecha-G. As the years passed, however, I started to see him in a new context. Of course he would look like Mechagodzilla, since he was essentially made from recycled parts. His arms and legs were a carryover from the humanoid design of Mecha-G, but were designed for long-range combat instead. I theorized that the reason for this change in tactic was because Moguera was a rushed job made to quickly fill in the gap as Mechagodzilla's replacement. If I'm correct, Mechagodzilla had twice as much development time, so here they couldn't replicate the more sophisticated qualities of his design, such as his physical strength, durability, and dexterity. As much as I appreciate the effort they went through to make Moguera's silhouette resemble that of his 1957 counterpart, I wish that they could have changed up his proportions, especially in the upper half, considering the tank-like nature of the mech. By distributing his bulk evenly across his body, he wouldn't look so goofy with his scrawny arms and wide hips. One thing that did bother me about this mech involves one particular shot during the climax where Moguera is knocked back by SpaceGodzilla. Here we clearly see the suit actor stepping backwards. The reason why this has annoyed me for years is because it's the only shot in the entire film where Moguera actually uses his legs as opposed to his tread-like feet. Was this a technical goof that ended up in the actual film? Or was this Moguera's way of preventing himself from falling over? If he could walk, then why does he need to move around on his roller skates? Now of course I can't talk about Moguera without mentioning one of the most embarrassing scenes to be featured in a Godzilla movie. That being the battle against SpaceGodzilla in, well, space. As you can plainly see, this sequence relies heavily on models and a backdrop with a few meteors thrown in for detail. But you notice anything missing? Anything that's usually, scratch that, always depicted in space? All kidding aside, the lack of stars, or galaxies, or any sort of celestial bodies, makes the sequence both laughable and extremely cheap. Especially when you consider that this was the sort of thing that E.G. Tsuburaya had executed far more successfully 30 years prior. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to Moguera is his ability to split into two smaller vehicles, which is a really neat gimmick that's very reminiscent of Power Ranger Megazords that required 3 or less machines to combine. It's a little distracting at first to see the robot's proportions shift radically in order to achieve this transformation, but given that I'm a fan of combining robots that have been guilty of doing this in the past, I was able to overlook this flaw. Finally, we come to the big baddie of the film, SpaceGodzilla. Now, being that he's yet another genetic clone of Godzilla, there's a lot here to like, as well as enough to scrutinize. First thing to note is his insane origin that would give any astrophysicist an aneurysm. Supposedly, Godzilla's cells were exposed to the vacuum of space either by falling off of Mothra's body or Biolante's space rose form. These G-cells somehow got swallowed up by a black hole, came out of a white hole, absorbed energy from dying stars, and assimilated crystal organisms. Now, it's not like we saw this take place or anything. No, instead, all of this exposition was revealed in a UNGCC meeting. How in God's name did these scientists come to this conclusion? What evidence was there to suggest that any of this took place? All they found was that SpaceGodzilla's DNA was identical to Godzilla's. As for the convoluted theory, I can get behind the idea of assimilating star power and crystals, but white holes? Did the writer of the film really thought that black holes were portals to another dimension? Well, putting the BS science aside, the concept behind SpaceGodzilla is a rather neat one, and carries over the themes of Biolante to an extreme degree, where Godzilla's very presence is so influential that even his DNA is dangerous enough to tip the balance of power, though not just here on Earth, but now space itself. The origin is also a great and not so great example of handling continuity. I like how this film heavily references Biolante, especially in the case of Yuki's character arc, as well as Mothra, given that she used to be a recurring character in the Showa series. However, with the time travel shenanigans that occurred in King Ghidorah, this would make it impossible for the events of Biolante to exist in the first place. If you haven't watched my review for Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the protagonists traveled back in time to alter Godzilla's origins so that he would make his first appearance in 1992, thus wiping out the 80s Godzilla from existence. It's clear to me that because of how badly written the time travel was in King Ghidorah, I'm assuming that the writer simply ignored it and kept the 80s Godzilla in continuity. However, Moguera was salvaged from Mechagodzilla, whose technology was salvaged from Mecha King Ghidorah. You can't just ignore some aspects of past continuity while acknowledging others. What is this, Doctor Who?
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
Thankfully, the next time a Godzilla film ignores all of this timey-wimey nonsense, at least they didn't bother bringing up any plot devices that could have arose from King Ghidorah. Now that I've said my piece on his origins, SpaceGodzilla isn't a very complex creature, though his motives are very interesting. Despite being born hundreds of light years away, he somehow instinctively knew the location of his origins, and already had plans of making it his domain. And much like how Godzilla had traveled great distances to meet creatures like him, SpaceGodzilla does just that with Godzilla. Though while Godzilla had attempted to initially act sympathetic towards his brethren, SpaceGodzilla shows nothing but disdain, as if he represented all the rage and hatred that Godzilla had accumulated over the years. As for the special effects, his suit continues the general idea of making big, flashy looking suits while lacking the flexibility to move around much. Luckily, this does play into his power set, as he's able to rely on his crystals and telekinesis for projectile attacks, thus giving us the peak of the Beam Wars tradition that started with Godzilla vs. Mothra. This sadly results in a climax that's not as impressive as it could have been, since it's all reliant on beam spamming, and you can only get away with so many projectile attacks before the sparks and animated lasers become boring. Luckily, the fight choreography improves once Moguera splits, allowing for a more complex finale as both Godzilla and the humans attempt to weaken SpaceGodzilla through their strategies. And as a nice nod to the previous film, Godzilla once again uses his Spiral Atomic Breath, an attack he gained from Rodan in order to defeat Mechagodzilla. After watching this film, I was really teetering between giving this film a 1 or a 2. Its plot is a complete mess with nonsensical science, idiotic characters, distractions left and right, and worst of all, it wastes a lot of genuinely good ideas. And that's what's so painful about this film, the fact that it squanders all of this lost potential that could have led to an exciting narrative. It attempts to build a story made to set up Godzilla as the hero, while giving its protagonist an opportunity to see Godzilla not as a villain, but as a unique specimen that humanity could rely on, and therefore should be left alone. However, by the end of the film, it honestly feels like nothing was gained from this latest outing, outside of Yuki's character arc. And despite how previous films had a strong influence on future installments, the events of this plot won't even matter at all in relation to the next film. In fact, you can take SpaceGodzilla out of continuity, and it won't change this overarching continuity one single bit. So not only is this a bad film, but it's one that takes so many game-changing ideas and does nothing with them. I personally believe that making a bad film that wastes its potential is a much greater tragedy than making a bad film that didn't have any to begin with, and that's why I'm giving Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla a 1 out of 5. Now, as I've said at the beginning of this review, this film does have its supporters, and if you just so happen to be someone who likes Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, that's perfectly fine. If you can find more enjoyment out of this, then more power to ya. After all, I'm just some guy on the internet who likes to talk about Godzilla. Who am I to tell you what to enjoy? I'm just throwing my opinions out there to anyone who's willing to listen, and for those of you who have, thank you. Now stay tuned for more, as I'll be tackling the grand finale of the Heisei Godzilla series, and see what 11 years of continuity amount to with Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Until next time everybody, take care.